Okay. Hi, everybody. From Low Carbon City, we're a global citizen-led organization that promotes low carbon cities and that tackles climate change from a collective point of view. We're here joined by Jill Cubit of DearTomorrow, Kevin Green, who from rare.org, Lacey Kegel of the Drawdown Ecochallenge and of the Northwest Earth Institute, and Sophie Atwood, who's a senior behavioral scientist of the Better Buying Lab. And we're here to discuss behavior change to tackle climate change. This is a very brief introduction. The idea of this conversation is to first discuss how individuals can learn and can change their behaviors to live more sustainable lives and to tackle climate change. And so I'm gonna let our brilliant participants introduce themselves. Why don't you go first, Jill? And organizations.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Cubit. I am the co-founder and director of a storytelling project called DearTomorrow. And DearTomorrow is really a lens for people to kind of think differently, to think more deeply about climate change. And what we do is we ask people to imagine someone that they care deeply about, their child or their grandchild, or maybe even think of themselves living in the future in the year 2050, and having a conversation with that person about the actions that we're taking now on climate change to create a safe and secure future for the people we love and also for our communities. And so really how it works is that we want people to kind of think more deeply about what climate change means in their own lives, and then to create and write and share these stories with their friends and their family and their social networks. And then we as an organization work to kind of amplify these stories through social media, through events, activities that people do in their own communities, and also, you know, through videos and other ways that people can kind of share these stories. I'd say two more things to just in my brief intro. One is that we partner with individuals and organizations who want to carry out the work in their own communities. And so we know that there's a lot of interest from people to you know, think more deeply, more creatively about how they can engage on climate action. We also know that there's a need within communities to have really interesting tools where people can kind of do this work with the people in their own lives. So we work through partnerships. And the second thing I would mention is that, you know, most of our participants right now have been in the United States because that's where we are, but we do partner with organizations globally. And we've had submissions from more than 50 countries and more than a dozen languages. So I know this is a global audience, so I wanted to add that. And I look forward to this discussion.
Why don't you go ahead, Kevin? You can now introduce your work and what you do at Rare and how it impacts behaviors and, well, in general, your work.
Sure, thanks. I work for Rare, which is a global organization working to inspire community-led behavior change to solve challenges that range from coastal overfishing to climate change to sustainable agriculture and a whole range of issues. And the team that I lead at Rare is called the Center for Behavior and the Environment. And we are working to bring the best insights from behavioral science and design thinking through a process that we call behavior-centered design to bear on these challenges. So we're translating what we know from the science of human behavior to application to solving these challenges in the field.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Now we're going to let Lacy talk. Lacey, tell us more about your work and what you guys do at the Northwest Earth Institute and the Ecochallenge and all of those interesting things.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be on this call with everyone. I'm looking forward to learning from you all as well. My name is Lacey Kegel. I'm the Director of Learning at Northwest Earth Institute and Ecochallenge.org. We work with adults to help them change their behaviors to create a more sustainable world. So we have two main programs that we do that in. We have discussion course books on sustainability topics that lead to community action. And then we have the Ecochallenge, which we have several different versions of that event that happen throughout the year. So we have a public Ecochallenge in October. We have the Drawdown Ecochallenge, which is happening this April. And we have a Plastic-Free July Challenge, which happens in July. So these are events that are online, digital events that encourage people to change behaviors. Most of the folks who are doing these programs already have things that they want to do to change in their lives, and they need that extra incentive to make it happen. So instead of designing infrastructure for behavior change, we're designing programs that help people change those behaviors that they're already kind of bought into and just need that little extra motivation. It is set up so that there are teams and there are points that people get for changing actions. And then they get to see the impact of those behaviors in real time. So you can see your own impact, you see the impact of your team, and then you see the impact of everyone participating in the event at the same time. And we work internationally. So most of our work is in North America, but we also do work throughout the world with Ecochallenge. And it was really awesome to partner with Drawdown because they had all this great information. And then we took it to the people to say, okay, if you're not an engineer or you're not working in agriculture, how do you put these solutions into action in your everyday life? So that's coming up in April if anyone's interested. All of our programs are free.
Perfect. Thanks, Lacey. That's wow. That's a lot of things. We'll be sure at the end of the hangout to share on all our social media and all of the platforms all the interesting initiatives you guys are doing and the different eco challenges and challenges that we're doing to encourage this change in behavior in individuals. Sophie, let's hear from you as a scientist and with the World Resources Institute. What can you tell us?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting us here to talk today. It's nice to be part of this. I'm Sophie. I work as Senior Behavioural Scientist for the World Resources Institute, and I work within a programme at WRI called the Better Buying Lab. And the Better Buying Lab combines insights from marketing and behavioural science with an aim to shift consumers to more sustainable behaviours. And the area that we're specifically focusing on at the moment is trying to shift consumers' diets. So we're looking at moving people away from beef and towards plant-based foods as an alternative. And we are primarily based in London, but we run studies both online with samples from around the world, and we also work to conduct in the field research, primarily working with industry to see if we can kind of implement and scale our solutions to reach large numbers of consumers at a time. That's me.
Great, great. So we're going to start with the first question. I don't know who wants to go first, but the question itself would be, first, it might seem kind of basic, but what are these set of behaviors that in everyday life and as consumers and as individuals we have that have impacts on climate change? And what would be your diagnostics of what is being done today and what we should aim towards? Who wants to go first? Maybe Sophie. Since
I'll take the mic. So I think, I don't know if your viewers will be familiar with something called Project Drawdown, which is a project that looked at rank ordering different solutions to climate change. And that was according to CO2 reduction costs and savings of the potential solution. And within the very long list, so there's a large number of different solutions, they've rank ordered the actual individual behaviours that would be useful for individuals to take to try to combat climate change. And in the top 10, you have some very kind of quite well covered and obvious examples, including food loss and waste. Shifting diets is up there, so moving from beef to plants. And then we have another area which is kind of educating women in family planning. So there, I think, some of the key individual level behaviour change that are priorities. More broadly answering that question, I think what I would be looking for in a individual behaviour that I thought was an important one to consider would be the degree to which we know the behaviour has an impact on the environment or on the climate, and then the extent to which that behaviour is scaled en masse across large numbers of people. So we're really looking at, is the behaviour really important, and is it affecting large numbers of people? So that's probably how I'd go about answering that question.
Perfect. Well, that's great. Drawing from that, Lacy, how, from your perspective, that's really related to education, how would you define these individual behaviors that do exist in a system and in, well, literally in the world we live in, and how would you measure so the impact and really teach to encourage this change of behavior?
Yeah, so we are measuring a lot of the things that Project Drawdown has measured. We do this in different ways. Some things are actually really challenging to measure, and when you're looking at a bunch of people who are saying they're doing things, that can, you know, some folks decide that they're going to ride their bike everywhere they go, and some folks are going to ride it to work. And so that you're working with a lot of different behaviors and a lot of different contexts. So some of our work is actually measuring the reduction in CO2 emissions. And so we can say you did not put this much carbon into the atmosphere with your behavior. And sometimes we're just actually measuring like those more direct impacts of how many people did you talk to? How many cups did you save from the landfill? Things like that. So when we're looking at incentivizing people to change their behaviors to address climate change, sometimes that impact is looking directly at those factors that affect climate change. And sometimes it's looking at things that people can see the measurement of to provide them more motivation to say, oh, I can see what I did, because tons of CO2 in the atmosphere is really difficult for some folks, for most folks, to understand what that actually looks like and what that really contributes. So I would say we're looking at the same behavior changes that probably everyone else in this call is looking at, but we're trying to figure out what measures actually motivate people to take more action as well. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's what I got from it.
Great. No, that's really interesting, because it's not only the individual behaviors in itself, but also how the change is generated. Kevin, what would your insights be from RARE? Because you guys also really focus on the measurement and the research on generating these sort of changes.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add, you know, just in terms of thinking about behavior change, you know, just behavior change in and of itself is an important concept, because it says that sort of ultimately the problems that we're trying to solve are driven by behaviors and decisions and habits at many levels of a system. And so those problems have to be solved by affecting or influencing those decisions or behaviors in some way. But it's also a pretty challenging concept because it can be so broad. And so behavior change can mean changes to the everyday habits of individuals and households, what we might call downstream, and more sort of upstream changes to the decisions and practices of corporate and political stakeholders and things like that. So at RARE, we're really interested in examining entire systems of actors and their behaviors. But one area we're really interested in, sort of with respect to climate change, is what the other panelists are speaking about, is sort of the downstream behaviors of individuals and households that, it turns out, make a tremendous contribution to the global budget of greenhouse gas emissions. And given the existence of a lot of really interesting innovations that support behavior change, have a lot more potential of being adopted quickly than the policy change that we're all sort of waiting for. And so I think the Better Buying Lab and DearTomorrow and the Ecochallenge are really great examples of those sort of innovations. But that's not to say that the policy change isn't also critical. And so we're also really interested in the idea that individual and household level behavior change at scale is actually what's needed to drive some of the needed policy change, because a lot of what behavioral science tells us is that contrary to what we often assume, attitudes about our behaviors are formed sometimes after our behaviors themselves. So we actually, by starting with innovations that support behavior change, we can generate more policy support and create essentially a positive feedback loop. So we're getting really focused on innovative strategies to use the latest in behavioral science and design, or as I mentioned, what we call behavior-centered design, to put that cycle into motion by promoting adoption of things like plant-rich diets, reduced food waste, adoption of electric vehicles and rooftop solar, reduced household energy demand, and the list goes on.
Perfect. Wow. So Kevin, you directly mentioned my next question. That's for all of you. And maybe Jill, you could start, because you mobilize citizens, but DearTomorrow also insists in its communication, and it's leading people to ask themselves how to talk about climate change in this specific debate, because we're talking about individuals. So behavior change tends to be seen as an individual, at an individual level, but as Kevin said, the idea would be for it to create a positive feedback loop. But in our work in Low Carbon City, and I guess in general in climate change work, there has been this emerging debate on focusing the burden of fighting climate change on the individual is a mistake, and that we should focus the fight against climate change and on making corporations and governments accountable and actually implementing courageous and big policy plans, and that blaming the individual would be a mistake in our strategies. What is your intake in all of this? And if anyone wants to contribute after Jill, that would be perfect.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time over the last couple of years really thinking about, what are the actions that we want people to take? Because when people write DearTomorrow letters, they often say, like, this is how I think about climate change. This is what the hopes that what I would like the future to look like, and this is what I'm willing to do. And so we've been able to kind of collect from people kind of what are the things that people say that they're willing to do. And then we've also used the best practices in research and kind of what's drawn from Project Drawdown and others to say well, what should people do? What are actually meaningful actions? And so to tie the last question to this question is that we kind of have come to a framework that says that we need people to be actively engaged on 3 different levels. One is on the individual level, what they can do in their home, and people have mentioned transportation and energy and food, and there's other things. But there's also these other spaces where people can be actively engaged. And one has also been mentioned, it's on the political side, how can we tie climate change to our voting practices, to calling our representatives, being much more engaged in direct action or in other community organizing. But there's also this social space that exists in the middle, which is what are the communications and how are we talking about climate change? And is climate change part of our cultural narrative? We actually see that they're all related to each other, and that it's not one or the other, that you actually need movement and engagement in all 3 areas, and that there's a relationship between them. So, if people are more willing to take a meaningful action in their own lives, they actually are starting to influence the people around them, and they're beginning to influence the norms, or the social norms, what's considered to be normal for people, and it is influencing other people. And so we know that in order to actually get the big policy or structural changes, we also need to have an engaged we need engagement from people. We need people to show that these are actually things they care about. And they do that through their behaviors and through how they communicate those behaviors.
Great, Jill. Yeah, no, that's absolutely it. From the perspective of the researchers, let's say whoever wants to speak, what your position would be on this? How can you make this research that's on individual behaviors and how to effectively change them? How would it connect with the more broad policy effects that should be steps that should be taken for climate change? Who wants to go?
I can add some thoughts if you'd like. So I'm definitely kind of with Jill on what she just said. I think one of the things that I think we've come across working in the consumer space is the idea of like supply and demand. So a lot of the companies would say something along the lines of, we are willing to take action on climate change and the environment, but if it's not demanded by the consumer, and it's not going to be profitable for us, we're not going to do it. And you get some instances where a company may have made a change to offer products that are potentially, less damaging for the environment, but the consumer take-up's been really low. So I think there's a definite role for consumers taking the position to demand change in the organisations that they interact with, and that requires the consumer to be in a position of being kind of empowered and aware that there's a problem with their habitual behaviour that they're engaging in. So they need to raise their awareness to demand those changes. I think the other point, which is a key one in terms of individual behaviour change. So I think some of the concerns are you're placing the responsibility on the individual rather than the organisation, so it becomes a blame game. And the other argument quite often put forward is it's just futile. Well, how can my individual behaviour make a difference? And I think the futility argument is kind of countered by the idea of scaling. So your individual change might have a tiny impact, but scale that up over to the population of the world, that together has a huge impact. So I think that argument's one that can be kind of crushed quite easily. I think the personal responsibility argument versus the structures around you is a bit more of a difficult argument to, I think the other panelists might have a better view on that. I kind of think there's a phrase that says it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And I think that kind of places it quite nicely in where I think individual behaviour plays. So you're a tiny piece in a bigger puzzle, but I think it's a puzzle that if you can, you should make. That's my opinion. Be interested to hear what the other panelists think about that as an issue.
Great. Kevin, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I would just sort of pile on to what Sophie and Jill said and really agree and add, I would say we sort of respectfully disagree with the notion that, individual action can't have a significant change. Obviously, from the perspective that we've all shared of sort of driving systemic change that supports sort of change at the policy and corporate level, but also, as Sophie said, it's not a particularly strong argument to make that individual change can't make a difference. Because at scale, it is the whole thing. And so, a couple of people mentioned Project Drawdown. Last year, we looked at Project Drawdown's analysis of the top, 100 solutions to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and identified that, sort of in our own kind of analysis, identified that fully 30 of these are what we would classify as fundamentally driven by individual and household level adoption, which is to say the solution exists and really kind of the last mile is getting individuals and households to adopt them. And the total emissions reduction potential of these 30 is somewhere in the range of about a third of the total emissions reduction potential of all 100 drawdown solutions. So it makes up actually a tremendous piece of the pie if you consider it sort of at scale. And so we wrote this up into a report called Climate Change Needs Behavior Change, which you can find at rare.org/center. And since then, our team has been spending a lot of time really digging into this tremendous potential for behavior change at scale to have a direct impact on emissions, as well as sort of the indirect impact of driving larger scale social and policy change.
Lacy, what would be your take on that? How, from the Northwest Earth Institute, and well, obviously from the Ecochallenge, you guys really do believe in the potential of climate change and the individual behaviors to tackle climate change. But how would you respond to the critiques that only systemic and structures are the ones that need to change, and that it's impossible for individuals to have an impact on that?
Yeah, well, this is definitely a yes and answer to everything that's been said already. Absolutely in line with how we think about it. I would say two things. I think it's really important for us to hear those critiques because I think it helps clarify what we're doing and our methods. I think that those critiques are based upon the idea that individual behavior change stops with the individual. And if you change your lifestyle and that's all you do, then it's going to take far too long to create the scale of change that we need to address climate change. But I think what everyone here is saying, and the way that we address this, is that it's, Jill said it really well in her 3 different ways that they need people to act, that it's not just about your own individual lifestyle change. It's also about creating communication around climate change and a behavior change. It's about modeling that for other people so that it becomes more of a norm or a standard. And it's about using your place in the system to be able to push the system to change. So there's this idea that individual behavior change is somehow outside of the system, and that's just not true. Individuals are a part of the system. So when individuals are modifying their behaviors, they are having an impact on the system. We just need to see all the different ways that we can have more immediate and more long-lasting change, which includes individual behavior change as well as acting to change those systems. And the way I explain this to folks who aren't really familiar with behavior change theory is that behavior change theory is about incremental steps. When you are trying to change a habit, you don't try to change 10 habits at one time. You try to change one little thing and get really good at that and then build upon that. And that's what I see as individual change is the very first step. Changing your own behavior, changing your household behavior, changing your community behavior, and working to change a larger system. That one step is really needed. If you don't have the one step, you can't go the distance. So how are we putting all of these individual steps together to create the scale of change that is needed? And I think also the immediacy of that change is really important too.
Great. So coming from all of this that we've just talked about, the debate is important, but then most of the critiques that come to behavior change as a tool to tackle climate change also, I think, sometimes come in the platforms that we use, social media, etc., from individuals, because it's a natural emotion, and climate change is also an emotional problem, since, well, it can give a sort of anxiety, and then in itself it is one of the most crucial issues we tackle on today. Most of these critiques also come from, I think, places of either fear or guilt regarding behaviors. And this leads to my question, that is, what are the best practices on actually changing behaviors that you guys have found through your work? Because changing a behavior takes a lot of different things. Sometimes it's realizing through shame, which is a valid option. Sometimes, obviously, it is an example. Also, what Sophie talked about, it's a question also of availability, of like demand on a market. So in general, so what would be these best practices to actually encourage behavior change that you've found through your work? Why don't you start, Sophie?
Thanks. I think what we've tended to do is think a lot about the two-system model of decision-making that's quite popular in behavioral science at the moment. And it was the one that Daniel Kahneman wrote about in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's the idea that not all of our decisions are consciously thought through, rational, careful, kind of deliberate decisions. And we operate quite a lot off a kind of very automatic part of our brain that responds with immediacy to the environment around it. And that's a really useful model for us to use specifically, because in the area of food choice, and if we think about things like a supermarket or a restaurant, you're making a very rapid decision that's not a kind of conscious choice necessarily. So based off the back of that model, what we're trying to do is really build solutions that work on the system, this first kind of automatic system, rather than going down the route of kind of education and informing consumers of what they should be purchasing. So our work in shifting diets over the last year or so has been looking at the role of the language of plant-based foods. So if we can describe plant-based foods in really attractive ways, almost co-opting the techniques that other industries use to sell products, we can actually increase consumer demand for these foods. And we see evidence in things like uplift in sales if we go from describing a plant-based dish one way to making the description more indulgent. So that's a technique that we found really effective, and it's an approach that we're looking to expand now. So language being one way you can target this automatic system, but there's a whole range of different techniques. They're often called nudges. And what we're doing at the moment is just basically putting together a compendium of all the different approaches that would be useful to use in food service and food settings for plant-based diets. So I think that's what we found to be a really useful approach so far.
Great. Lacy, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so we are working in the educational space, and so a few things makes that different for us. One is, even though we're working with individuals, we're usually working within already existing organizations or groups of people. So we're definitely working to create a change in culture through individual behavior change, so that these different behaviors that are better for the climate are becoming more of the norm or standard within a culture, an organization, or a group of people. With education, there are kind of two different approaches that we use that at first glance might seem completely opposite of each other. So approach that we've been using for 26 years now is transformative learning. So this very deep metacognition questioning of the assumptions that we have about the world and our place in the world, and like making those things explicit for people to be able to see them and then be able to change. And I would say most people would talk about these things as sort of aha moments of like, oh, this thing that I didn't know I assumed about the world, or I didn't see, and I suddenly feel like the blinders off and I see them. So that definitely is work that we do with folks to get them to make explicit those implicit connections or assumptions that they have about the world. And then behavior change is sort of the opposite. So as Sophie was talking about, a lot of people are making decisions and they are not explicit decisions. And you see this a lot in behaviors, people who might even believe that they should quit smoking or something like that. And so everything's there. They think that they shouldn't do it. They think it's better for themselves or whatever. And then they don't do it because of addiction and everything else. So how do we change behaviors that then change paradigms to create a better system that leads to a better, not reducing climate change and a better planet for everyone. So we actually use those two things together, and that's just the terminology. Behavior change and transformative learning is the terminology that's used in education for these things. But I think it's really similar to what Sophie was talking about, what other folks are talking about, how when we have people self-selecting into our programs by the nature of them. And so they're somewhat already on in the choir, so to speak, as far as wanting to change behavior. So we're working with a very different population than probably some of the other folks in this conversation who are trying to create mass change in a different place, in a different part of the system.
Great. Kevin, so the same question, but as I saw, Rare's work is also quite international. So, and you guys have a lot of different geographical focuses, which also changes from the traditional model in which we perceive this behavior change that would be sort of in a very, let's say, Occidental country where having a sustainable life is complicated because of how the industrial system works and how agriculture works and everything. So what would be Rare's good learned lessons on these sort of things, on how to change behaviors, but at a global scale too?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, Sophie's and Lacy's answers were also, great. I would add that, we think about this from the perspective of there are probably a few sort of human level, there's a whole wealth of insights from the behavioral sciences that give us kind of different tactics that we can think about to influence behavior. And there are probably a few sort of ways we can summarize those to reflect potentially a sort of a different point of view about how we should engage individuals in our various interventions. If we sort of take the traditional sort of approach to be what we all recognize is an outdated assumption that people are sort of rational, self-interested, utility maximizing decision makers, we try to bring some additional principles to how we think about the motivations and influences of individuals. Things like emotions are often more powerful than reason. People are inherently social animals who like to cooperate, who like to reciprocate, who care about their reputation. And the context and timing of our decision making matters quite a lot, often just as much or more than the actual choices that we have in front of us. And so we're trying to bring those sort of generic principles to how we engage people in whatever intervention we're talking about. And those are sort of human level traits. We just know those things about people as a species, but the way that those are, to answer your question, the way that those are manifest in any individual or group can vary quite a bit depending on where you are geographically and culturally, et cetera. And so we sort of have to combine that human level, what we call behavioral lens about how people are really motivated with a really deep set of research and empathy development with our target audience to understand their actual motivations and needs and desires and the benefits and barriers to their ability to adopt new behaviors. And it's actually a combination of those two, a really sophisticated understanding using a behavioral lens of how people are motivated, for which, Lacy and Sophie articulated just a few of what are many, 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 many insights from the behavioral sciences, combining that with this sort of deep empathy and understanding of a specific target audience is essential.
Great. Jill, so you're the one who has the most practice in actually moving these, I guess, non-rational, so moving beyond the idealized model of individuals as rational beings, because DearTomorrow really knows how to engage feelings. What for you is, well, how do you view your work, and what would be your best practices and like the most important intakes that you've seen that work in the emotional space in which DearTomorrow works?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer this exactly, but I think that one thing we've learned through DearTomorrow, because DearTomorrow at its core is a kind of a storytelling project where people do talk about things that are kind of very emotional, very difficult to kind of understand and try and make it more personal. I think our work fits within an emerging group or body of work that's around how do you use creative practices and creative strategies. And I think that those kinds of tools, they do a couple of things. Like, one, it gives people an opportunity to like connect their own values or their own identities with an issue that they may have not done before. So it's a much kind of deeper way of engaging. It's a deeper way of, it's a more thoughtful process. And what we're really getting at is like, how do how do we begin to align people's identities with this issue, and how do we get to people to see themselves as actors and being part of the solution? And those practices, so those practices that I think that we do, but also there's other creative engagement groups do, they provide people opportunity to reflect, they provide people an opportunity to write and share or communicate with others. And they just kind of allow people to connect within what they already care about with an issue. And so we're really getting at kind of looking at what values-based approaches can actually influence people to kind of think differently, be more engaged, be more committed kind of in the long term, and not just saying like, I'm going to do this one thing and I'm going to check the box and I'm going to move on, but getting people to identify themselves as somebody who cares about an issue, and then beginning to look around and say, well, are my actions in alignment with the values that I hold and that I care about this? And then beginning to think about how we can align our actual practices in different parts of our lives with kind of what we care about. The second thing I think that creative things do, I'm a big fan, obviously, of like creative engagement. I think it allows people to think not in the present necessarily, but think in the future, or be more imaginative about what they would like to see. And so I know people who are participating through like doing work with virtual reality or augmented reality, or they're doing theater or books and digital projects. They're basically allowing people for a moment to sit somewhere else and imagine something differently. And I think when you allow kind of that creativity and that experience, you just hit people on a much deeper level. I think that the thing that we need to think about when we're designing these like creative processes is, do we then provide people enough information so that they can actually take on something that they want to do or make the changes? So I think it's important to kind of align the creative process with an actual like recommendations for actions or suggestions for something that they can do that's meaningful, so that people don't feel like they go through this like emotional process and then they're left with like, what can I actually do? I'm not sure I answered that. Exactly.
No, that was brilliant. That was brilliant, Jill, and that's exactly what I wanted us to talk about. It's the bridge between, so you encourage the action and to actually internalize it, and for it to lead to this virtuous cycle that Kevin was talking about. So, well, we're almost finishing up, but I did have one last question. It's kind of a general one, but it's important for our audience to know. So specifically, as a professional in this area, but also as, I guess, someone that is worried about this topic, because it is quite worrying and we have to act now or yesterday. So what advice would you give people or even organizations that are starting that want to be part of this change and don't know how exactly to start, and especially don't know where to focus on engaging this behavior change in themselves and in others? Who wants to start? You can, Kevin, or yeah, you go, Jill. Perfect.
I mean, I think that all of the suggestions that were given, I think were really wonderful. And there's a lot of great resources out there. I invite anybody to go to our site, DearTomorrow.org. We have an inspiration page. We've kind of looked at, I was talking before about this individual, social, and political actions. We've been trying to create a list that's not 100 or 1,000 things you can do, but what are the things that are kind of that rise to the top of the list? So how can you change your lifestyle in terms of transportation, energy, and food, but also how can you talk more about climate change? How can you get more politically involved? So I'd offer that as an option. And then I would just tell people, just pick something that is meaningful to you, that you think that you can do, and do it, and really think about why you're doing it.
Great. Kevin. what would be your tips for people and organizations to really engage this behavior change?
Sure. So I'll make I'll offer a tip through a quick plug. We're really excited to have last year launched a partnership with Conservation International, National Geographic, the Nature Conservancy, the United Nations Development Program, and the World Wildlife Fund to find and spotlight the most promising solutions that are using behavioral insights to change the way people consume to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that was called that's a solution search contest. And it was called Climate Change Needs Behavior Change. And it will award 2 $25,000 grand prizes to the most innovative and promising solutions that are already demonstrating effectiveness in the real world. We got somewhere around 200 entries from 46 countries around the world, three of whom are some of my favorites are on the panel right now. Some of the best examples. And the 2 grand prizes will be awarded on stage at a Climate Change Needs Behavior Change Summit we're hosting in collaboration with National Geographic on March 19th. So that'll be held at the National Geographic Museum in Washington, D.C. And I'd strongly encourage anyone to go to rare.org to find out more, because there are some really tremendous experts and leaders participating in some exciting surprises in store that sort of bring climate change and behavior change together. My team at RARE, the Center for Behavior and the Environment, is also just sort of on a mission to empower more practitioners around the world to use insights from behavior-centered design to change behaviors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So you can find out a lot more about that at rare.org/center.
Great, perfect. We'll be sure to put all of the links in the YouTube video and on social media so that people can check out all of those resources and get inspired. Lacy, what would be your intake on how, for individuals and organizations, on how to really engage this behavior change for climate change?
Yeah, so I have some, I guess, like just smaller practical steps for individuals. Part of changing in behavior is starting with something that's actually accomplished, like you can actually accomplish. So having a stretch goal, but having it still be achievable, and starting with one thing and then kind of building from there is really important for changing your own behavior. But I would say for both individuals and for organizations or groups of folks who are looking at trying to change behavior, remember that it's mostly, almost always socially motivated. So being able to create a fun program, or getting multiple people involved, or sometimes competitions helps. But that socially motivated part of behavior change is a really important thing to keep in mind when trying to change behaviors. And then also, oh, I had a thought and now I totally lost it. Sorry. But I think that those are really important things. And remembering that also, as has been said multiple times, that people do not make decisions rationally, that a huge part of why people do what they do or don't do has to do with identity. And sometimes they're not even aware of that. So recognizing those, again, that kind of human psychology behind behavior change, I think is really important. So those are a few things I would say. Like, there's some great kind of popular press books out there about different aspects of behavior change from multiple authors. So I think it's really easy to kind of see like what's the basis behind this. And then I guess to highlight our programs, we have 3 public Ecochallenge programs that happen throughout the year, one in October, one in April, one in July, that are all a little different, that are really awesome, free way to get started. We also have a campus Ecochallenge. So if you are on the campus and wanting to do that's more geared towards students. And then we also have programs where you can really adapt them to your own needs as well. So we have tools that are available for people if you're looking to do this in your own organization, or if you're looking to find other folks who care about this stuff too.
Perfect. Thank you, Lacy. Finally, Sophie. So same question, but I wanted also to take advantage of your particular insight into consumer behavior and how, as consumers, we can be more aware of our choices or try to make better choices in tackling climate change, and also in encouraging our peers to be better consumers to change our behaviors.
Can you hear me? So is that working?
Yes, it's working. It's working.
So I'm obviously really biased, but I think plant-based diets are a really important shift. If I was going to put my money on one, I would put it there. It has a massive impact. It's a behaviour everyone eats every day, so there's so many opportunities for you to engage to make a shift. And I think that it's also a really good exemplar behaviour to kind of reflect what I think the rest of the panelists were saying, which is, in order for your behaviour to have an impact, really one of the main things is that you're going to have to make the change, and it's going to have to be something that you keep at over a long period of time. And really what that is, if you have a behaviour that is quite easy and it's rewarding, and plant-based food really hits the mark on both of those elements. So for me, I think that's a really good, if someone's new to the area of individual behaviour change. Is my mic cut out, or are we good?
The last 15 seconds, I think, cut out. What were you saying?
I was saying that the plant-based diets are a really good example of a kind of test case for behaviour change, because it's an easy and a rewarding shift to make. So it's one that people tend to stick at over time. And it's one that we have the opportunity to engage with every single day. So I think if someone's thinking about initially what they can do for the climate, it's a nice entry behaviour into kind of thinking more broadly about that space. There's a range of consumer behaviours that have an impact on the climate. I think a big one that's attracting attention at the moment is actually clothing and the apparel industry. So that is a space that's moving quite quickly to alternative models of consumption. So rather than fast fashion, buying things and chucking out, we're having a range of different clothing options like rental or secondhand. So that would be an area I think that is going to be coming forward and rising kind of in consciousness generally. So I think that that's a good one to look out for, and I think a good one for consumers to start to be aware that that might be something they should change their behaviour around kind of in the near future.
Great. So I think we'll be finishing up. So I wanted to extend an invitation to everyone watching and to you guys. We also have our own challenge going on in Low Carbon City that's called 30 Days for the Climate. It's a social media campaign in association also with DearTomorrow and the Climate Reality Project here in Latin America. It's both in Spanish and in English. And so obviously to check out Rare.org's initiative and summit that you guys are going to have is in April, right?
March 19th.
March 19th. And obviously an invitation to all to write a letter with DearTomorrow. It's a lovely initiative to check out all the work that's been done with the World Resources Institute at the Better Buying Lab. And obviously the Eco-Challenges. So once again, Lacy, there's one in April, a university one, a campus university one, and one in October. I'm correct?
Yes, so the Drawdown Eco-Challenge is in April. There's Plastic-Free July in July, October Eco-Challenge, and then there is a year-long, continuously running campus Eco-Challenge for those who are in higher education.
Perfect. Is there any other last insights or commentaries that you guys might want to say? No? Perfect. Well, thank you guys very much. Thanks to everyone that's watching, and let's continue forward. The solution is collective, but it also comes from us individuals. And I wish everyone a very nice week.
Thank you.